Hello, thank you for joining us for today's Ask the Pet Food Pro. I'm Debbie Phillips Donaldson, Editor-in-Chief of Pet Food Industry, and I'll be your moderator today. Ask the Pet Food Pro is a series of expert chats brought to you by Pet Food Forum and the editors of Pet Food Industry. You can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. Most of our Ask the Pet Food Pro chats are on more technical subjects. They address a specific area of pet food manufacturing or marketing formulation, safety, and the like. Today, we have a special edition, the beginning of a series we hope to help pet food professionals develop and grow as leaders. The specific series is brought to you by Women in Pet Food Leadership, which is a program that connects and empowers women and their allies in the pet food industry through events like this, plus mentorship and networking. Our expert today is Dr. Jon Evans, Assistant Professor of the Organizational Behavior and Human Resources Division at Sauder School of Business at the University of British Columbia. He takes an evidence-based, interactive approach to leadership development. Welcome, Jon, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to come here and talk, and I hope that I can say something that's useful.
I'm sure you will. Before Jon starts, he's going to present some of his research on how emotions like humor and anger are perceived in the workplace, especially when women display them. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with 3 women leaders from the industry. We'll introduce them at that time. First, I have a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, you've all been muted, so we can better facilitate this discussion and not have anyone interrupting each other. Some of you submitted questions beforehand, which we really appreciate, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And then because you're muted, if you could please put any questions or comments in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that when we get to the panel discussion part. So, and then one more thing, sorry. This is being recorded, and it will be available within about a week on petfoodforumevents.com. If you go to the About tab at the top of the page and then select Ask the Pet Food Pro in the drop-down menu, you'll be able to find it there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask Jon to share his and start his presentation.
Well, again, I really appreciate the invitation to come here and present some of my work. I genuinely hope that what I present and talk about can be useful. Most of the findings that we have here, I wouldn't categorize them as encouraging, but I'm hopeful that if we can sort of accept what they are and then have a good conversation about what to do about it, then we can use these findings to hopefully accomplish something useful. What I'm going to talk about is how the way that we interpret the behavior of leaders is oftentimes driven by stereotypes we have about people. So I'm going to start by explaining the general principle of how this works, and then I'll describe 2 studies that we have conducted that show this in operation. The general idea is we're interested in when we observe the behavior of others, in particular in a leadership context, how do we form impressions about who that person is? What sorts of information do we rely upon to form those impressions? And there's a fancy theory name that we rely upon to answer some of these questions. But let me see if I can hopefully explain it in a way that's useful. So we rely upon a lot of different information in making assessments of who people are. And in 2 sets of particularly important information that work together are what we observe in terms of the behavior, as well as what do we expect from that person in terms of stereotypes we might have about that person. And what this particular theory says is that these 2 things operate together to constrain our interpretation of what we're observing. The simple example of this is if you were to observe somebody giving an elbow nudge to another person. One possible interpretation is kind of a more jovial interpretation. They're just kind of joking with the other person. Another potential interpretation is more of a violent act of aggression towards the other person. And so when we're unsure of how to properly interpret the behavior, that's where stereotypes come into play. And there's lots of evidence indicating that when a Black man gives an elbow nudge because of stereotypes about Black men, it's more likely to be interpreted as a violent shove. So this is the general idea of how stereotypes are constraining our interpretation of behavior. And so let me highlight 2 particular types of behavior that are open to multiple interpretations. and how existing stereotypes tend to guide our thinking to interpret those behaviors in specific ways. The first is being funny at work, adding some humor to a presentation, making an amusing comment in the meeting, saying something to generate laughs in others. And this kind of behavior at work is open to different interpretations. One interpretation, which is far more positive, is a functional interpretation. Being humorous at work, in meetings, or in group interactions, it can facilitate accomplishment because it can kind of grease the social skids, so to speak, and allow people to interact in a more positive way. It can reframe problems so that they seem less troubling and you're able to tackle them better. And then humor can also diffuse negative emotions. So we might interpret humor as being very positive and useful in the work context. On the other hand, it's also possible to interpret humor at work as being more disruptive in nature. It's designed just for entertainment. It's just about being amusing and fun. We could interpret it as being sort of distracting from the seriousness of work. And given that humor in the workplace can be interpreted in multiple ways, we thought that gender stereotypes might be one way in which our interpretation of humor is constrained or sort of guided in one way or the other. And we thought this because the two gender stereotypes about men and women, they tend to align with these two interpretations. So for example, the functional interpretation, there's a male stereotype that men are achievement-oriented, that they're very competent and ambitious, very task-focused. And that stereotype, that's very much aligned with this functional interpretation of humor in the workplace as something that helps us accomplish work and does good things for us. But on the other hand, there's a stereotype about women in the workplace that is more aligned with this disruptive interpretation. The female stereotype that exists in the minds of people is that they're low in agency, that they have family responsibilities, that they're taking on multiple roles. Therefore, there might be a lower commitment to their work role because they have maybe pulled in other directions for other roles. This stereotype, it's much more in line with the disruptive interpretation of it's distracting from work. So we decided we wanted to look to see at, there's lots of factors that go into our interpretation of humor, and we wanted to isolate the degree to which gender is a unique factor in this interpretation. And so in order to do that, what we did to test our thinking was to run an experiment. With an experiment, we could carefully control changing just one element of what a person sees in the judgment that they make. So we created 4 videos. We hired 2 actors, one male, one female, and they gave 2 versions of the same presentation. In one version, they included some humorous comments. And in another version, they didn't include any of those humorous comments. So the script was the same in the 2 funny conditions. The script was the same in the 2 not funny conditions. And then we recruited people to come and watch one of the videos. And after watching one of the videos, they would rate the leader. How much status do they think that person has in the organization? What is their leadership capability? Would you promote them into a higher leadership role within the organization? And what we found was that when participants watched the video of the humorous female, they're much more likely to interpret that humor as being disruptive in nature rather than functional in nature. And because they interpreted that humor as being more disruptive, they rated that female leader as having lower status within the organization. And then that lower status meant that they're less likely to recommend them into more senior leadership roles. They thought that they had a lower leadership potential. And one important finding that we had in this research is that the gender of the rater, it wasn't a factor in this interpretation. These gender expectations really exist in the minds of all people. And so we're all kind of subject to this biased interpretation where the stereotypes are guiding our thinking in one direction. A second study we ran is to look at the expression of anger in the workplace. There are many situations where It might be very important in a leadership role to show a little bit of anger. It might accomplish some necessary things in terms of your leadership role. And but there are two different ways in which we might interpret the expressions of anger in the workplace. We might interpret it as being about the context, or we might interpret it as being about the temperament of the person who is expressing the anger. A contextual interpretation is where we think that the anger expression, it has something to do with the situation that that person is in. It's a reflection of that broader situation. Perhaps there's an issue of injustice that they're expressing anger about. Perhaps they're expressing anger because the situation is quite serious and requires our added attention. So that's a contextual interpretation. Whereas a temperament interpretation is where we see that anger and we think that's not saying something about the situation, that's saying something about that person. It's a reflection of their disposition. It's an indication that they have poor judgment, that they have an ill-tempered personality. And naturally, if we see anger and we interpret it as being about that person and not the situation, we're far less likely to think they're capable of being in a leadership role, less likely to give them a good recommendation, less likely to put them into a higher leadership position. So once again, because we wanted to isolate the specific effects of, well, hold on, let me first talk about a stereotype where we thought would constrain this interpretation. And this time, we looked at a specific racial stereotype more than broader general gender stereotypes. And the stereotype that we looked at was the stereotype of the angry Black woman. And perhaps you've seen this stereotype depicted in movies and TV shows. There's a whole bunch of research that indicates this stereotype being very prevalent in movies. It's the Black woman who's very verbally aggressive, that she's kind of irrational in her anger and hostility, and especially in media, it's depicted as the Black woman who emasculates her male partner. And what we argue in our paper, in which we went and tested, is that this stereotype is much more aligned with the temperament interpretation. That what we're seeing is an indication of the personality or disposition of the person. So once again, because we wanted to isolate the specific effect of race and gender on our interpretation of expressions of anger, we wanted to use an experiment so that we could just isolate those particular effects. In this case, we ran two different experiments. One experiment, we used videos, just like in the first study I explained, and we created 8 videos. We hired 8 actors, half were Black, half were white, half were male, half were female. And each of the 8 recorded 2 versions of the same video, one where they expressed anger and one where they did not express anger. The context of these videos was receiving performance feedback from their boss. So sometimes in one video, they would get angry about the negative feedback, and then the other video, they would not express anger about the negative feedback. In a second study, we found evidence for our effects in the first study. And so in the second study, we just narrowed in and looked just at Black women versus white women. In this case, we recorded audio clips of women leaders expressing some instructions to a follower. And in half of the cases, they would express some anger in those instructions because of the situation, and other cases, they said the same things but didn't express anger with the instructions. Once again, we recruited people to come and either watch one of the videos or listen to one of the audio clips and then rate that leader on, do you think that what you saw was a function of that person's disposition, or was it a function of the bigger situation? And then we asked people, how likely are you to put this person into a more senior leadership role? We asked them to write a letter or recommendation for this person for promotion. And we would code that letter in terms of how positive it was. Overall, this is what we found. And the results I'm showing you here with these bar charts are from the video study. We found that the highest temperamental interpretations, and that's what's shown on the y-axis in these particular bar charts here, is that a higher level on the y-axis indicates a higher level of a temperamental interpretation. What you're seeing is indicative about the person and not the context. And the highest ratings for that were for Black women. And as a result of those ratings, Black women received the lowest performance evaluations. They received the lowest leadership ratings. And once again, similar to what we found in the humor study, neither the gender nor the race of the leader were a factor in that were driving these interpretations. So once again, this stereotype of the angry Black woman, it exists in the minds of all people. It guides our interpretation of behavior for all people. So like I said, I wouldn't say either of these studies are like encouraging, but I do think there are some important limitations and implications that we should note. And then hopefully, as we transition into the panel discussion, we can really get into some nice details of what we might do about this. One important limitation in these studies is that the context here is always a first impression situation. We went this direction because we wanted to isolate all other factors. But I think it is important to recognize that in terms of first impressions, it's possible that these effects are stronger in those situations. It might be likely that as you spend more time with a person, then those stereotype expectations begin to be overshadowed by more individual information you have about that person. So that's one limitation to be aware of. In terms of implications, let me just highlight a couple of important ideas. The first is, I think it is useful that we recognize that stereotypes influence how we interpret behaviors. And in this case, what I'm talking about is all of us in our judgments of other people. We should be aware that the stereotypes that exist, and we all have them there, they're sort of subtly pushing us to think about behavior in certain ways. I can think of plenty of news stories where I'm thinking of the one in New York where the woman saw the Black man taking photographs in the park, and she interpreted what he was doing in a more negative way. So we should be aware that these expectations have this kind of influence on us. And when we're aware of that, we can be better at intervening in that automatic process. There's plenty of studies that indicate that when we are motivated to treat people fairly and we're aware of potential biases like these, we're more likely to intervene into that automatic process. So that's one important implication from this work for all of us. Another, I think, important implication is that it's useful for us to challenge the interpretations of others. Yes, we might see this in operation ourselves. We might also see this in terms of other people's comments about behavior. Perhaps we're in a panel where we're talking about promoting people into positions, and we might see some interpretations that other people have of behavior. This might be an important way for us to intervene to ensure that those interpretations are not being influenced by stereotypes about people. And then the implication that I would love to kind of transition into our panel discussion is there's lots of research indicating the benefits of being authentic at work. Our study on humor was partly motivated by a robust amount of literature highlighting the positive benefits of humor at work. When leaders are humorous, the people that they're leading are more likely to challenge the status quo and come up with creative ideas. And so there's lots of benefits of being humorous at work. And because this barrier exists of negative interpretations of women expressing humor, it's important for us to find ways to help women who would like to be more humorous at work to feel free to authentically do that and be that in the workplace. Same thing with expressions of anger. Plenty of situations where in a leadership role, it's important and useful to express anger. And if Black women are faced with this added hurdle where if they do that, they're going to be interpreted in a negative way, well, boy, we should find some ways to help them feel more empowered to authentically express what they feel that they should express in situations. So I think that's an important implication that perhaps you can feel validated that this sort of subtle bias that exists, we do have evidence that it's true. It does exist. So we should seek for ways to help us feel empowered to be more authentic and true to what we think we should do and be in different leadership roles. So that concludes what I have to present to the group. Let me in my slideshow there. So I think at this point, probably a good idea to transition towards a panel discussion about what can we do about these things.
Yes, thanks, John. That was fascinating, and as you said, not entirely positive, but definitely worth discussing. So as he mentioned, we're going to start our panel discussion part of this, and I'd like to ask all the panelists to turn on their cameras and audio, please, and I'll introduce you all. Thank you. So we have Leah Lambrakis, Vice President of Research and Development, Nutrition and Scientific Affairs for Simmons Pet Food and Simmons Animal Nutrition. And Leah is also a steering team member for our Women in Pet Food Leadership program. Betty McPhee is an industry consultant and also a steering team member. She's championing our committee on leadership development, educational opportunities like this. And so she and her committee were very instrumental in putting all this together. So thank you to them for that. And then we have Dr. Kate Cheveler, professor and Champion Petfoods Chair in Canine and Feline Nutrition, Physiology and Metabolism at the University of Guelph. So I'd like to start the discussion with getting the impressions of all of you on the panel of what John presented. And while you're thinking, I'll give you a chance to think about that because we did have a few questions come in. And I just want, just in case people are not seeing them in the chat, and John's responses, thanks for those responses. So someone asked, would the interpretation of some of these emotions be different if age was added as a variable? And John, you said that did not seem to be a contributing factor. Okay, and then someone asked if they looked at neurodivergency, so like things like ASD or ADHD, and you did not. So that clears those up. So I think we may have lost Kate. Kate,
No, I'm here.
oh, you are. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I must be on
okay.
page 2.
Yeah, yeah. I forget the Zoom windows or can be different. Okay, so Leah, Betty, Kate, do any of you have any like first impressions from John's research or experiences that you'd be comfortable sharing in being interpreted yourself in a negative way or seeing someone else that way and how you may have responded? And I will let anyone who's brave enough to go first.
Go, Leah.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Totally thought I had to turn that on. So I think being in a leadership role as a woman, it is really, really important for my team and my peers and my business and my customers to all know that I feel as well, and building trust with those group of people that I just described is showing my emotions and showing that I am human. And what's been really meaningful for me as I've grown in leadership is making sure that when I am showing my emotions, I'm using those wisely. I'm looking to see how can I build a connection, maintain that loyalty, maintain that trust. Certainly don't want to seem like I'm spiraling out of control, but keeping in control, still maintaining that integrity, but showing that I'm real and I'm human and I feel things and I'm not apologetic about it. And that's just been my experiences over the last several years.
Can I ask, did it take you a while to get to that point where you felt comfortable a bit like doing leading that way?
Yeah, definitely. I would say earlier years, it was tougher, and maybe I just wasn't tough enough, and I remember sitting in conversations and truly feeling anger ball up in my throat. And I thought, oh my goodness, do not cry. These are angry tears, do not cry. I don't feel that as much any longer, so I don't know what that says, but I absolutely do believe that I've become stronger, more confident, but have tried to maintain that vulnerability and that empathy, because I think that goes a really, really long way with my team.
Great. Thank you. Betty or Kate?
Well, I could go ahead and go. So I agree about 100% with Leah. You know, I think as women, I always say men are black and white wires, and women are all the other colors. If you're looking at anything in the engine or anything like that, and I think it's so easy for women to. I think people just have a tendency to think women are going to show their emotions, and it's like, oh gosh, you know, what is she going to say? Is she going to cry? And I think it is okay to show those emotions because, like Leah said, it shows that you are human and that you have gone through a lot of experiences. And because you've gone through those experiences, it's led you to leadership. It's led you to be the person that people want to work with, that people want to be a team member with. And I think it's just so important to not shy away from emotion, just know how to manage it.
Yeah, so maybe I'll first give my impressions, a couple of things about the talk. The first thing is that when there was the definition of how people view women versus how people view men, I think that I'm viewed then like a man. So be very careful how you kind of interpret those things, because I think that women can embody those same things. I think that there are a couple of obstacles. I think I might add a part, and I'll an interesting story maybe for you, because I have a little, of course, I'm a professor right now, so that means that I have undergraduate students, I have graduate students, I have peers, there's staff, there's layers and layers above me, right? So it's very different how I operate in each one of those situations. But maybe as a lead in a leadership role, a really great example was some years ago when I had an undergraduate student come and seek advice. And I sit beside a male professor whose door was open, and he listened to the entire thing as well. So there's two parts here. First of all, at the end of the conversation, after having helped this student, they thanked me and then said, "I can tell that you are a mother." And I immediately was offended and had to unpack that, because the reason I was offended, because I don't think a student would ever say to a male professor, "Oh, I can tell you're a father." So there was things that student was expecting me to do. My male colleague overheard all of this after the student overheard that. And so after the student left, he came and he said, "Watching you has been the most fascinating thing," because he's always been surrounded by male professors in the past. And he said, "Your students expect that you will be more supportive than the male professors here, and that you will exude caring and empathy." So I think maybe one thing I would add to this whole thing is I agree that it's important to show emotion. And I have more recently, as I've gotten older, I was not good at it, and it definitely has developed. But I also provide some ring fencing for my students and call out, and Jon was talking about this, I call out biases towards treating me as a female professor and leader different than they're treating male professors, because we're starting here. So if I don't tell them that they're treating me differently because I'm a woman, they can't self-reflect on how they are treating the potential of a female boss or a male boss. So I hope that I start provoking that reflection in my students, which are kind of like my direct reports.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I thought that was one of the most fascinating parts of research and not in a good way, was that it's, the stereotypes are there, or the impressions, negative impressions there for, no matter what the gender of the rater. So, and Wendy commented on that in the chat box, and, that we all have these stereotypes and impressions. So, what she's asking is, are there mechanisms that we can put in place in workplaces, maybe within reviews, promotional opportunities, coaching discussions, maybe, that can help? You just gave an example of that, Kate, where you said, if you see that in students, you're calling it out. So does anyone else have any experiences where you've, worked that into someone, a coaching situation, or a, professional development situation?
I would say, especially in the last few years, where I feel like we've had much more real and transparent conversations as a team. Did a lot of this being on a screen together, seeing faces all day long, and trying to make light of it, and sometimes using humor was just the way that we would cope. And but at the same time, it could get to you, and maybe frustration or cabin fever or frustration would build, and it would be easy to get short with someone, or show that agitation. One thing I've relayed to my team that I am trying to do more than I did before was doing something called practice the pause. I read this quote in a book by Brianna Weiss that talked about the importance of practicing the pause and choosing when it is the right time to react and when it's not beneficial to you or to your audience, and giving yourself that time to kind of gather those emotions, come back with a clear, concise, compelling reaction rather than showing an emotional reaction. And so we've, and it's funny, my team will say it to me, oh, I can tell you were practicing the pause, Leah, or I will coach a team member saying, practice the pause, and sometimes the pause is a little intimidating back to the receivers, and they're saying, well, she's not saying anything, what's going on there? And so I think being able to choose the right time to show those emotions can lead to a very respectful, like I said, trusting relationship back and forth.
Okay. Betty, did you have anything to add to this particular point? You're muted. I know it's going to be a thing. It's going to be a thing during this whole thing.
Well, I think it is important when you are in situations too, and finding that balance about the emotion, and controlling anger or frustration, because it's so easy to get frustrated and to get angry. If you've been in meetings all day and you're exhausted, and you have somebody that comes in and they may have an attitude, or they don't have an attitude, and they don't have any personality, and you're like, okay, what do I do in this situation? And I think it's okay to just take a step back, and I always just say I gotta process, and taking a pause is a very similar process to that. But I think taking a step back and really putting yourself in that situation, and if you were walking in somebody's office, how would you want that person to react? And I think that's something that we have a tendency not to do. We don't
Right.
look at the situation that we're in from the other person's perspective. And I think that's important. That's one thing I try to do, is whether I pick up the phone or you're on a Zoom call, or face to face, and just, if that person is angry, or they have an attitude that you just don't want to deal with at that time, it's easy to say, okay, maybe they're really dealing with a lot more than I know about. And a way to be gracious and professional is to say, hey, do you have a lot going on right now? Can we just reschedule this? And I think
Right.
just showing that you're generous you're open to flexible situations, and I think that goes a long ways too.
Agreed. And you talked about, trying to view things from someone else's perspective. And Kate, after your talk about, how you were perceived by that student, someone commented that it's kind of funny because she interpreted that as a great compliment. That someone thought you were very nurturing and supportive, and that was a good thing. So yeah, so everyone has different perspectives, and it's something we all have to keep in mind. And so we've kind of touched on this, but we had a question come in, and we had one come in beforehand too about, the balance. You mentioned balance. And so there's been questions about, how do you balance the need to show the person here today said volubility, but maybe a little anger or maybe a little patience. If there's someone's like, like, hey, come on, we need to get off the dime and get this thing going. How do you balance something like that with, being a good manager without intimidating people, without, I think there's just people trying to figure out how do you balance the emotion part of it with being a good leader and giving direction.
Maybe I'll start because I think what we do catapults into what Leah and Betty do. I set clear expectations as for both my undergraduate students, on a direct report basis, more so I think you see it at a graduate level. And at the beginning, we talk about what my expectations are. And I am also, as we're kind of talking about leadership traits, I warn everyone who comes to work with me. I run fast. I'm incredibly blunt. It is not to be taken personally. It is to be taken constructively. You need to own your future, so you need to own that narrative. And I am here if you need to share personal obstacles. So I think it starts right at the beginning with a very clear definition of what our expectations are and what our management skills are. And I'm also very clear about my ways of working and what I need. I'm an incredibly busy professor, so I don't have time to be doing work for my students, as an example. As most senior leaders would say the same thing. You can't be on the floor doing the job that you did 20 years ago while you also lead. It's just not possible as you kind of migrate. So authenticity right off the hop, very clear indications of what the expectations are. And then I learned from my time in industry, we do quarterly reviews. There are 3 points of where students are doing things well. There's an area to work on. And I always make sure that I support that area to work on, depending what it is. And with students, so it's wide ranging from language services to writing to it's all over the board. So that's my point.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit on something that maybe important thing to discuss. And John, I'd be interested to know if you'd ever done any research on this. Is like, I think to be a good leader, you have to know yourself and know your own strengths and weaknesses and how you express those. And that's part of being authentic, right? Because if you do know yourself and know, what you need to work on and where your strength is, and as you put it, you communicate that, as directly as possible, Kate. I mean, maybe not all of us do it as directly as you would, but you tell people, you let people know who you are and where you're coming from. That probably goes a long way. I mean, John, have you done any research on that, on awareness of self-awareness of leaders?
I haven't done any research on that, but I will say that I teach leadership development for in the MBA programs here at Sauder at UBC, and the course I teach is very much built around spend time understanding what your strengths are, spend time understanding what your values are, and then use those together to clarify who you are as a leader. And those really should be your yeah. So spending time to clarify, what are your strengths, what are you good at, and what are your values, what do you care about? When you have a clarity of those things, you can be much better at being clear about who you are as a leader and more effective in doing so.
Okay. So I took us a little bit away from the whole balance question. So, Betty or Leah, do you have any thoughts or experiences about, balancing that sharing of emotions while also being, seen as an effective leader?
So I can go on this one. So I think there's been, I've had a lot of experiences in this, and I think we all have. One thing that I always try to go into a situation with is I say to myself, be personable and don't take it personal. Because there's so many times, and I'm a emotional person. I wear my heart on my sleeve sometimes, and that's where I bring in humor. So if it's a contentious situation or if it's an awkward situation, it may be because I'm making it that way, but it's typically the other person. I'm allowing that person to make me uncomfortable. And so I think I have to step back and say, this is not personal. This person doesn't know me. When they know me, then they can treat me, differently and have more emotions. But when they don't, then that's when I just try to not take it personal. There's a lot of experiences where you can have employees come to you and not have um, the right mindset because they do look at you and they say, well, can't you help me do this? And if you, like Kate said, if you have your expectations communicated properly and you review those on a regular basis, it's easier to obtain them because they don't have that apprehension. Well, I don't really know what she wants from me. And if you've communicated that, I think it makes it so much easier. And knowing that that employee always has an access to you if there's doubt or if there's questions or resources needed, that they know you have an open door. And I think that's so important.
I would agree. I think what Jon was saying earlier in his first few slides about humor being very contextual, and I think it could be cultural. There can be stereotypes attached to it. It can be very emotional as well. And what might be funny in one room with one audience might fall completely flat with another, or someone might take offense to it. And so the context is really important. Reading the room, knowing your audience. Sometimes I just use humor to connect, and it's someone like myself who I call a practicing extrovert. Sometimes adding humor to like put a little ripple in the air helps me, gives me the ability to relax a little bit. And using humor when it's situational and it makes sense in the room, maybe helps just cross those boundaries a little bit easier and then get to business. I even see it in my own son who's approaching 17. He was fiercely shy as a younger boy, and he used humor to cope in uncomfortable situations. And I think we're very similar that way. But at the same time, there is kind of that boundary where you want to ensure that they see you as real and human, and you have emotions, and you're not perfect. And sometimes, conversations can get a little bit spicy, and I just make sure that they're respectful conversations, and that's really important to me, being, authentic and real, but really being respectful to one another.
Agreed. So let's explore the whole humor angle a little bit because we've had several questions come in. We had one come in before this hand asking, can humor be used in the workplace without it being taken as passive aggressive or just taken the wrong way? Which I thought was an interesting question. And I think the taken the wrong way makes some sense because sometimes, I mean, I admit I'm a smart aleck myself. And so I will make flippant remarks and people just don't get it, So, and again, you have to remember, everything you're saying is right. You have to remember the context, the person, the situation, whether that's appropriate or not. And are there other, I mean, do any of you have this experience where it's taken the wrong way, taken as passive aggressive? And Kate, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you and I were talking the other day and you talked about, there's a difference between a joke and an insult. So, any comments from the panel on that aspect of,
If I could just interject slightly on
Sure,
this
please.
one. In my research with this paper, we did spend some time looking at different types of humor. And so passive aggressive would be just one type of humor. Self-effacing humor, sort of like even like directly aggressive humor. There are other forms of humor that exist that don't necessarily have to be more passive aggressive. So I do think it's possible to be humorous in ways that are avoiding that type of humor. The factors that would make it interpreted as more passive aggressive would be another question I don't know answer to, but anyway, it's helpful to know that.
That is. Thank you.
And I think it has to
Thank you.
come from the right place, right? I mean, never using it as you said, John, to knock someone down. It should be lifting a room up. It should be a way to, release or relieve maybe some of that tension. But if humor is used to make fun of someone, be critical, throw a backhanded comment, I feel that's inappropriate in the workplace. And that's when it would probably start feeling a lot more passive aggressive for sure.
Yes.
I would agree. I think you have to have humor in the workplace, and you have to laugh at yourself. I think that's one thing that has helped me is when you go in and you have to know your audience. You have to really understand the situation that you're in, and it's okay to come up with a corny joke or something like that, or a little icebreaker. That's something we do on our committee call. It's like, who's going to come up with an icebreaker? And I think little things like that, it helps, and it shows that you are human and that you are in this meeting, or if you're making a sales call, or if you're in with R&D, whatever the situation is, it shows that you are present, that you really want to enjoy these people that you're with. You really have a purpose for being there. And it is a fine line, because you would never want to intentionally say something that anybody could take as offensive. And it is a fine line.
Yes.
I might first of all, I lecture undergraduates, so we often, I don't know if Jon thinks about this when he lectures. I'm sure most of you have heard me speak to the pet food industry, and that is nothing like how I lecture undergrads, because they are largely much less interested than you all are. So part of what we have to do is we have to entertain. And I do this through humor, but it's interesting we're all talking about making jokes kind of outward facing. And I constantly, the amount that my students know about me, I'm a nutritionist, so obviously we have to talk about urination and defecation. So the amount of information they know about me is insane, but I at least get them laughing to try to get them to learn. And that's the other part, is I find that when everybody, first of all, if they're laughing, they've engaged, right? So you've got engagement, you've got a potential growth opportunity. And so you just kind of have to try to drive that home with the teams that need to be engaged. And I also find that if you're making fun of yourself, I think it builds trust faster when you're putting yourself out there. I'm going to put this caveat, and Leah has known me for a very long time, so she can attest to this. I am not uncomfortable really showing people personal information, which is both, and I'm also super extroverted. So that is easy for me. And I don't think it's easy for some other people. So, that's a tactic that I use because I'm comfortable with making fun of myself. And then I'm very careful when I respond to things. So I'm not going to share what I shared with Debbie about what the insult was, but I was pretty sarcastic in my response. So I tend to use sarcasm to let people know that I'm offended.
Yes, there's always good ways to handle it. And, you gave very good examples of, obviously to engage younger people, you have to entertain them these days. Especially, someone commented that, absolutely humor is important. It can often be the catalyst to regathering continuity that might have been sparked by a bit of conflict during a collaborative project. So yeah, I mean, we all have been on teams or projects where tensions arise. It's just normal. And sometimes, a little humor can deflect some of that tension, ease some of that tension, I think. Another question we had come in beforehand that I thought was interesting was, what about cultural differences in understanding humor and interpreting humor? And John, I think we may have talked about this the other day. If I don't know if you've done any research on that, but if any of you experienced, maybe a bit of humor being misinterpreted because of a cultural difference.
I'm going to say yes. I have no solutions, and I still don't know how to handle it correctly. So
Okay.
I'll bend it back, John. This might be a great area. I particularly misfire with my international students that are Asian. I haven't figured this out yet.
I would say I would agree. It's a challenge because it's kind of like what we've been talking about. You go in with intent, and the intent is not to offend anyone. But this is where humor does come in. And, if you say something and then the person, you can read. I mean, that's one thing that there's so many books out there that tell you how to read body language and emotions. And people like me who have very emotional looking face, that you can tell right away what I'm thinking. I think when you look at a person and you've made a comment, the very first thing to do is be humble and say, if that offended you, that was not my intent. Can you help me understand how this offended you? Or can you tell me more about your culture? I think there's a lot of ways just to spin it in a very professional and a very personal way so that they know that you're sincere. And I think, honestly, that's about all you can do, because it's not something you intend to say or do that would hurt somebody.
Right.
And I think you're right, Betty. How you express your emotions signals your leadership style. So your tone, your posture, the way you show up really represents who you are before words even leave your mouth. And so being conscious of that, we talked about, reading the room, understanding where you are. I live in the Northeast, but I'm often down in the South, and that's where my home office is, right? And I'm not sure they have still figured me out or what to do with me, right? And so,
or maybe vice versa.
right? That's okay. But I think they, again, it comes down to just that respect that we have for one another. And I think, again, if you're using your emotions wisely, it's not always perfect. Sometimes, like I said, we don't know what to do, but, we've caught each other's attention, even though we don't know what to say back to each other. Practicing the pause is where that comes in. It could throw people off, but it also means they're paying attention for sure.
Right.
I also think, if I can end that with, if you feel that, maybe you're testing each other, trying not to take it personally. It could be the situation at hand. I think Betty said earlier, you don't know what's going on in someone's life, and everybody, every single day is dealing with something.
Right.
And so trying not to personalize it, I find that very difficult for myself. I'm an overthinker, an overanalyzer, and trying to compartmentalize that, set some boundaries. That's been really critical for me lately, is setting those boundaries, just to have my own emotional balance and check at the end of each day.
Right. We have about 5 minutes left, although we can go a little bit long if people need to. But we've had a few questions come in related to anger, and that obviously was a big part of John's research, and also a big part of the stereotypes that are very common, unfortunately. So someone asked, how have you navigated situations where anger or frustration is appropriate versus situations where it has not been appropriate?
Well, that is $1 million question.
It is. It is.
I can maybe give a appropriate. I'm going to think a little bit more about the inappropriate. I think I have actually there too. Appropriate. I do find when I'm advising my graduate students, especially, it is if they're not progressing in a way that we originally talked about, I have to simultaneously be frustrated while being empathetic and pushing them through. So you have to kind of balance all of those simultaneously. And I've definitely gotten better at that as I've aged. I think where I did it wrong, I have many mentors now, and this is going back to my Procter & Gamble days. I lost my father in 2009 suddenly, and I came back to work a week after he had passed. So I'm also an only child. I was living in a different country than my mother, so you can start seeing all these obstacles, right? I should have put bigger ring fencing around me because I responded multiple times far too quickly and emotionally. And I needed, if I was to give my past self guidance, and I wish thrown my former managers under the bus here, but I wish that they had also done it for me. A better way that they could have led the organization was to have a conversation on the side about, like, this must be incredibly hard for you right now. Expect that she might not react the way that she's normally reacted. So I think that comes with age too, and that personal reflection, right? Where you're reflecting, you become wiser. I know if I experience something like that again, I'm putting ring fencing around myself, or I'll probably tell someone off, to be honest. If you know, it won't be nice. Yeah. So.
One thing I found that I had to learn this the hard way myself, to be effective is, if you have to, to put it the way I think of it, so you have to get on someone's case about something like, hey, you did not handle this correctly. A constructive way to frame it, even if you're showing some frustration or even a little bit of anger, is to say you're holding yourself back. So make it about their behavior and their career development rather than you're making me angry. You're frustrating me. If you make it about them and helping improve themselves, and like just pointing out, like, this is, you're getting a bad reputation and that's holding you back. I found that to be effective rather than, again, making it about my emotions. Leah or Betty, do you have anything to add?
I would say when I'm being faced with, I don't deal with a lot of anger in my workplace, and I feel very fortunate for that. But when I'm being faced with, let's say, resistance or frustration, again, just thinking, okay, I want to step back, but then at the same time, I'm curious, and I'm someone that needs to talk it out in the moment. So, coming back with questions, pausing, letting them speak, making sure that they feel heard is really important, because you'll see that frustration or anger start to calm down, and even asking, like, what about this is hard for you? What do we need to do to move forward? And it could be rooted into something way different that we don't even understand, or we didn't realize, or maybe there's something I did prior that I wasn't aware of. And so it's just trying to address it in the moment. Sometimes is the way to go when you're being faced with that, or realizing, as Betty said, maybe we need to just give each other grace and walk away for a little while and come back to it. I think it's quite situational,
Yes.
and depending on the individual, for sure.
Right. And making sure that, if you're being disrespected, if someone's coming at you, we had a question come in where it sounded like there may have been some disrespect going on. And if that's happening, I think it's perfectly fine to say, I don't have to take this kind of language from you. I'm going to step away and, please follow up with me when you've calmed down and we can discuss it, in a calm way.
I think to that point too, it is about grace, being graceful, and it's okay. We are women, and it's okay to be strong about that, and be strong and say, I am emotional too, and make that person feel like you're at the same level. And if somebody comes in and they're angry and they're disrespectful, to say, I have days like that too. Let's sit down. Let's go get a cup of coffee. You try to diffuse it, and you let them know that you're on the same level. We all have bad days. Whether it's a bad hair day or you have a flat tire on the way to work, whatever it may be, and just have that openness and embrace the fact that we are strong women and we can still show that emotion and be gracious to people.
Yes. And someone commented, sort of asked, and this may be a good way to wrap up. I think we've touched on this, but does your experience with use of humor or anger vary when there's a status difference? So whether you're talking to a peer or to one of your supervisees, or whether you're talking to a supervisor, is there a difference with how you show your anger or humor or other emotions? And I would say yes, but I don't want to speak for everyone else.
Yeah, I would say yes. I still want to be authentic, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I'm being appropriate depending on the scenario and the individual.
Right.
Okay. You have to assess the situation and take a pause and assess what you're going through and how the best approach is. Nobody has all the answers, and that's okay, because that's how you learn. If you make a mistake, chalk it up and go, wow, that was a great learning opportunity.
Good point. Good point. Anything to add, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think if you take away the undergraduate, I am fairly similar in the way that I communicate to all levels. I think too, though, maybe what has changed over time, and I've always been rather fearless, which is I think has helped me extraordinarily. But I certainly now am the most fearless I have ever been, and I think that helps me be authentic when I'm with very high level leaders, and maybe levels up a bit, right? So I might speak to them a little bit differently, but it's evolved to being actually now a lot more similar to how I speak to my colleagues.
That makes sense. Leo, or was it? Yeah, I think it was you. You mentioned the book, the Pause. What was the book that you referenced?
The Pivot Year by Brianna Weist. I might say
Okay.
Weinst. And it's one of the very early chapters where she references practicing the pause.
Great. And someone also gave a recommendation for a fun book, if interested, Going Dutch in Beijing by Mark McCrum. So I think he was speaking to the cultural differences. So just to as one way of wrapping up, we will be emailing a survey link and also the link to the recording when it's available. And we'll include in that because Betty and others have mentioned other books that they've found helpful. So we will include in all that a list of some of these books that have been mentioned and ones that Betty had mentioned earlier. So hopefully that will be good follow-up. And also, if anyone has any specific things, just let us know. So yeah, the power, and someone else commented, The Power of the Pause by Effie Santos is a good book on the topic too. So so there were lots of great comments. I'm afraid we could, sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'm very aware of the fact that it's a Friday afternoon or evening for some people. So I really want to thank Jon for sharing his expertise, and all of our women panelists for sharing their insights and experiences, thoughts, and being so open. It's been great. I thought this was a great conversation. Thank you all. Please watch for future offerings like this. I mentioned that we're hoping this is the beginning of a series, and we also want to do some things. Leah's championing a committee on mentorship. So I know her committee wants to do some online things related to that, and in-person things eventually. At Pet Food Forum this year, we will have a career development track, and also a couple different specific networking opportunities. So watch for those if you're registered. If you're not registered, there still is time. We would really appreciate your feedback. I mentioned that we'll be emailing a survey link, but there's also a QR code on the screen right now if you want to use that and give us your immediate feedback. Finally, a reminder that, again, this is being recorded, and if you don't happen to get the email with the recording link, you can check in about a week on petfoodforumevents.com under the About tab, and then select Ask the Pet Food Pro. So thank you again for joining us today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, and your weekend. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.